Snuck into a gritty Detroit gym. I, Jess, 19, taunted my stepdad Kel, 59, ex-boxing coach, hit me. Gloves on, I shoved him to the ropes. His grip got tight, sparks flew, not punches. Mom's away, 2 weeks burned hot, too hot. Bar night broke it, what stopped us flat? Yo real. I was 19, itching for trouble, when I, Jess, slipped out of our creaky Detroit house one muggy night, sneaking into the old boxing gym where my stepdad, Kel, a 59-year-old ex-coach, used to train fighters who'd hit hard and loved harder. Mom was off on a work trip, some corporate retreat, leaving us alone for 2 weeks. Her last call a brisk bet I'd stay out of fights, clueless as hell. I'd always caught Kel's eyes lingering, not quite fatherly, and it stirred something I didn't name. The gym was a ghost town, dust on the ring, leather bags sagging, but I'd swiped his keys, flipped the lights, the buzz humming like my nerves. I found a pair of gloves, scuffed and worn, and pulled them on, my tank top and shorts loose, hair tied back, ready to mess with him. Kel's truck rumbled up. I'd left a note saying where I'd gone, knowing he'd follow. He stomped in, his faded jacket open over a tight tee, gray stubble sharp, eyes narrowing as he saw me bouncing in the ring. He barked I'd lost it, I bet I'd break my neck in here. I grinned, flirty, punched the air, saying he was the beast, bet he'd hit me for real. He smirked, climbed through the ropes, saying hitting wasn't his game, bet I'd flop first swing. I bumped his arm with my glove, teasing, saying flopping was my spark, bet he'd catch me anyway. He grabbed a pad, held it up, his hand steady like he'd trained champs, and said swing, bet I'd miss by a mile. I jabbed, sloppy, my shoulder brushing his chest as I leaned in, flirty, saying he looked hot blocking, bet he'd coached wilder shots. He smirked, shifted, his knee nudging mine, saying Wild didn't sass, bet I'd tire out quick. I punched again, harder, my glove grazing his arm, teasing that tiring was my vibe, bet he'd push me harder. He lowered the pad, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering pushing was my hustle, bet I'd drag him down. I swung wide, stumbled, and shoved him toward the ropes, my hip bumping his, flirty, laughing he'd better fight, bet he'd pin me easy. He caught my arms, his grip tight but playful, pulling me close, his chest an inch from mine, saying pinning was my trap, bet I'd tangle him up. My stomach flipped, heat rushing, and I tugged free, flirty, circling him, teasing that tangling was my rush, bet he'd knot it anyway. He smirked, stepped up, his hands brushing my shoulders, guiding me back, muttering knotting was my chaos, bet I'd snag him deep. I bumped his elbow, saying snagging was my thrill, bet he'd hold on sharp. The ring groaned, canvas scuffing, and I jabbed again, my glove brushing his chest, saying he looked too good dodging, bet he'd take a hit for me. He smirked, blocked, his arm grazing mine, teasing, saying hits were my dream, bet I'd swing wild. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying wild was my spark, bet he'd light it too. He leaned in, his knee pressing mine, muttering lighting was my game, bet I'd blaze him out. I grinned, spun away, my shoulder brushing his back, teasing that blazing was my win, bet he'd burn with me. The gym echoed, lights buzzing, and I stayed in, bouncing, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake if I pushed. He smirked, dropped the pad, his hand brushing my arm, light, teasing, saying shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip this ring. I bumped his chest with my glove, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd steady me. He smirked, stepped closer, his elbow nudging mine, muttering steadying was my trap, bet I'd slip anyway. I laughed, bumped his hip, teasing, saying slipping was my play, bet he'd catch me tight. The air snapped, tension humming, and I stepped back, pulling off a glove, saying he was too good, bet he'd fight my spark. He smirked, tossed his cap, his hand brushing mine, teasing, saying fighting was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He stood, ring creaking, and I knew I'd hooked him, gloves off, fire on. Here's the second part, about 750 words, with flirty tension and intrigue, keeping it YouTube safe. 2 days after the gym stunt, I was still wired from that ring, Kel's grip, his smirks, sparking something I couldn't shake. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last text a curt bet I'd stay out of scrapes, not even close. I wandered into the kitchen of our Detroit house that morning, barefoot in a loose hoodie and leggings, the air sharp with coffee and grease. Kel stood at the counter, blending a protein shake, his faded tank clinging to his frame, jeans low, hair still wet from a shower. He didn't turn, just poured it into a shaker, grumbling I'd better not swipe it, bet I'd choke on it anyway. I grinned, slid onto a stool near him, my elbow brushing his arm, flirty, saying he looked hot mixing, bet he'd whipped up tougher shakes than this. He smirked, capped the shaker, and said shakes didn't flirt, bet I'd spill it first swing. I leaned closer, my hip nudging the counter's edge, teasing that spilling was my jab, bet he'd gulp it down. He glanced over, his hand brushing the shaker by my wrist, fingers tapping close, and said gulping was my dodge, bet I'd knock him out. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, saying knocking was my spark, bet he'd block it tight. He smirked, slid the shaker my way, his knuckles grazing mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this blend. I grabbed it, took a slow sip, teasing, saying owing was my hook, bet he'd cash it with that grin. He leaned on the counter, his knee brushing my stool, teasing back, saying cashing was my hustle, bet I'd con him into more. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying conning was my kick, bet he'd sip it anyway. He smirked, grabbed a mug, poured coffee, his arm nudging mine, muttering sipping was my trap, bet I'd reel him dry. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd tug it sharp. The kitchen buzzed, coffee brewing, and I spun the shaker, my shoulder grazing his chest, saying he looked damn good fueling, bet he'd trained hungrier fighters than me. He smirked, sipped his mug, his elbow brushing my side, teasing, saying fighters didn't sass, bet I'd starve out there. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying starving was my vibe, bet he'd feed me anyway. He shifted, his hand brushing my arm as he grabbed a spoon, rough and warm, teasing, saying feeding was my dream, bet I'd chew him up. I leaned in, my knee pressing his thigh, flirty, saying chewing was my thrill, bet he'd dish it back. He turned, leaning closer, his chest an inch from mine, muttering I'd better watch it, I bet I'd tangle this morning. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, and grabbed a napkin, wiping a drip slow, teasing that tangling was my spark, bet he'd stir it too. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, saying stirring was my chaos, bet I'd spill it first. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my win, bet he'd mop it anyway. He smirked, tossed the napkin, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering mopping was my trap, bet I'd soak him quick. The sun climbed, light slicing through, and I stayed there, sipping, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd shake if I pushed. He smirked, leaned in, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, teasing, saying shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip this counter. I grinned, bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it up. He smirked, shifted, his knee nudging mine, muttering holding was my play, bet I'd slip anyway. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying slipping was my game, bet he'd catch me tight. The coffee cooled, the room humming, and I stood, stretching, my arm brushing his chest, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the shaker, teasing, saying chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He leaned back, mug in hand, tension thick, and I stayed, knowing I'd hooked him, protein shaken, stakes stirred. Here's the third part, about 750 words, with flirty tension and intrigue, keeping it YouTube safe. For days after the kitchen tease, the Detroit afternoon sweltered, the backyard a patchwork of cracked dirt and weeds where I lounged on a frayed blanket, scrolling my phone, the air sharp with cut grass. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last text a gruff bet I'd keep it calm, not even close. I'd been chewing on Kel's quick smirks, his rough brushes, and it was hooking deeper than I'd meant. He came out, hauling an old punching bag to hang on a rusty frame, his faded tee tied over his shoulders, jeans scuffed, sweat gleaming on his arms. He grunted I'd better not kick it, I bet I'd bust it wide open. I grinned, tossed my phone down, flirty, saying he looked sexy swinging, bet he'd punched harder bags than that. He smirked, hooked the bag, and said bags didn't flirt, bet I'd swing and miss. I stood, sauntered over, my sneakers brushing the dirt near his boots, teasing that flirting was my jab, bet he'd block it sharp. He glanced up, his hand brushing the chain by my hip, fingers twitching close, and said blocking was my dodge, bet I'd throw him off. I leaned in, my elbow grazing his arm, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd counter it tight. He smirked, tugged the bag, his shoulder nudging mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this rig. I stepped up, my knee brushing his leg, and tapped the bag, swaying it, teasing that owing was my hook, bet he'd slam it with that grin. He grabbed it, steadying, his fingers brushing my wrist, teasing back, saying slamming was my hustle, bet I'd con him into more. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying conning was my kick, bet he'd swing anyway. He smirked, leaned closer, his arm sliding past my side, muttering swinging was my trap, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, nudged his hand on the chain, flirty, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd pull it hard. The sun beat down, dust swirling, and I circled the bag, my shoulder brushing his chest, saying he looked damn good out here, bet he'd coached grittier fights than this. He smirked, adjusted the chain, his elbow grazing mine, teasing, saying fights didn't sass, bet I'd tap out fast. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying tapping was my vibe, bet he'd keep me in. He shifted, his hand brushing my arm as he tightened a bolt, rough and warm, teasing, saying keeping was my dream, bet I'd swing wild. I smirked, pressed my knee against his, flirty, saying wild was my thrill, bet he'd take the hit. He stepped back, testing the bag with a jab, his chest close, muttering I'd better watch it, I bet I'd tangle this yard. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, and grabbed a water bottle from the grass, sipping slow, teasing that tangling was my spark, bet he'd punch it up. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, and sipped, muttering punching was my chaos, bet I'd bust it first. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying busting was my win, bet he'd patch it anyway. He smirked, tossed the bottle down, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering patching was my trap, bet I'd drag him out. The heat pulsed, dusk creeping in, and I stayed close, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd shake if I pushed. He smirked, leaned in, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, teasing, saying shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip this frame. I grinned, bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it up. He smirked, turned, his knee nudging mine, muttering holding was my play, bet I'd slip anyway. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying slipping was my game, bet he'd catch me tight. The yard quieted, shadows falling, and I stepped back, grabbing my phone, saying he was too good, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the bag, teasing, saying chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He turned, bag swinging, tension thick, and I headed inside, knowing I'd hooked him, punches paused, fire flaring. Here's the fourth part, about 750 words, with flirty tension and intrigue, keeping it YouTube safe. 3 days after the backyard spar, the Detroit evening settled warm, the living room soft-lit by a flickering floor lamp as I lounged on the couch, legs curled under, picking at a bowl of chips. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last voicemail a gruff bet I'd kept it dull, way out of touch. I'd been riding Kel's quick glances, his rough teases, and they'd dug in deeper than I'd expected. He came in from the kitchen, 2 beers in hand, his faded tee loose over jeans, hair mussed like he'd been pacing. He tossed one to me, his fingers brushing the can as I caught it, muttering I'd better not drop it, bet I'd make a mess anyway. I grinned, popped it open, flirty, saying he looked sharp playing host, bet he'd crack another for me. He smirked, sank into the armchair opposite, his knee nudging the coffee table, and said cracking wasn't my vibe, bet I'd talk it flat. I leaned forward, my elbow grazing the table near his arm, teasing that talking was my jab, bet he'd chug it up. He sipped his beer, his hand brushing the remote by my wrist, teasing back, saying chugging was my dodge, bet I'd reel him empty. I swung my legs down, my knee brushing his flirty, saying reeling was my spark, bet he'd pour it anyway. He smirked, shifted closer, his arms stretching across the table, muttering pouring was my hustle, bet I'd drain him quick. The beer fizzed, cool and sharp, and I slid to the couch edge, my shoulder brushing his sleeve, saying he looked damn good unwinding, bet he'd coached rattier nights than this. He smirked, leaned in, his hand brushing my arm as he grabbed the remote, light, teasing, saying ratty didn't flirt, bet I'd turn this tame. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying turning was my punch, bet he'd swing it wild. He clicked the TV on, some old fight rerun buzzing, his arm resting near mine, muttering swinging was my trap, bet I'd knock it over. I bumped his hip with my knee, teasing, saying knocking was my rush, bet he'd block me tight. He sipped again, leaning back, his eyes flicking to me, saying I'd better cool it, I bet I'd spin this room out. I smirked, bumped his shoulder, flirty, and took a long swig, teasing that spinning was my spark, bet he'd roll with it. He smirked, he shifted, his hand brushing my wrist as he set his can down, muttering rolling was my play, bet I'd drag him too far. I grinned, pressed my elbow into his side, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd tag along anyway. He smirked, his fingers tapping near mine, teasing, muttering tagging was my win, bet I'd snag him raw. The TV hummed, punches landing low, and I stretched, my arm brushing his chest, saying he looked too chill, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, leaned closer, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, warm, muttering flaring was my mess, bet I'd tip this couch. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying tipping was my vibe, bet he'd hold it up. He shifted, his hand sliding to my elbow, teasing, growling holding was my fantasy, bet I'd slip quick. I smirked, bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying slipping was my rush, bet he'd catch me sharp. The night thickened, the lamp buzzing, and I stayed close, sipping, saying he was too good at this, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the cushion, teasing, saying chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He leaned in, his arm brushing my back, muttering biting was my trap, bet I'd twist him out. I laughed, teasing, bumped his hip, saying twisting was my play, bet he'd swing it anyway. The room pulsed, tension humming, and I leaned back, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd shake if I dared. He smirked, turned, his hand brushing my knee, light, teasing, muttering shaking was my chaos, bet I'd tip this night. I grinned, bumped his chest one last time, flirty, saying tipping was my spark, bet he'd light it up. He didn't pull away, just watched, cans sweating, and I knew I'd hooked him, beers down, fire up. The day before Mom's returned from her work trip, I'd been writing 2 weeks of flirty games with Kel in our Detroit house. Her last text a horse bet I'd stayed out of trouble, way off. I'd convinced him for a bar run, craving a loud night. Dressed in a tight top and jeans, I hopped into his truck, his faded jacket open, looking sharp. He parked at a dive, muttering I'd better not start a fight, bet I'd drag him in. I grinned, flirty, tugged his sleeve, saying he looked hot for a coach, bet he'd dance me wild. The bar thumped, lights pulsing, music blaring, and I pulled him to the floor, swaying, teasing he'd better move, bet he'd match me. He smirked, stepped close, hands brushing my hips, light, saying moving was my mess, bet I'd spin him out. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying spinning was my spark, bet he'd catch it. His grip tightened, guiding me, his knee grazing mine, muttering catching was my trap, bet I'd twist him up. I laughed, spun, my elbow brushing his arm, teasing that twisting was my rush, bet he'd hold on. The crowd roared, and I leaned in, saying he looked damn good, bet he'd flare tonight. He smirked, pulled me closer, hands light on my waist, teasing flaring was my chaos, bet I'd burn this place. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying burning was my thrill, bet he'd fan it. He spun me, his hand brushing my shoulder, muttering fanning was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I grinned, stayed tight, saying blazing was my win, bet he'd stick. He didn't pull back, tension humming, and I knew I'd hooked him, bar loud, stakes louder. After the bar, Mom's return crashed our 2-week game in Detroit, her work trip cut short, her last text betting I'd kept it tame, clueless to my dance with Kel. We'd stumbled home past 3 a.m., drunk on bar beers, the truck swerving as I'd teased he'd moved too hot, bet he'd spin us out. He'd smirked, parked rough, and we'd tripped inside, my head buzzing from booze and his vibe. In my jeans and top, I swayed in the hall, jacket off, flirty, saying he'd killed it, I bet he'd take me now. He smirked, kicked the door shut, tee tight, muttering taking was my hustle, bet I'd wreck it quick. I grinned, stumbled closer, hip brushing his, teasing wrecking was my spark, bet he'd grab it. He grabbed my wrists, light, tugging me to his room, growling I'd pushed too far, bet I'd sink us. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest, saying sinking was my rush, bet he'd dive in. He shoved the door open, hand grazing my arm, steering me in, muttering diving was my trap, bet I'd snag him. I flopped onto his bed, jeans shifting, teasing he looked wild, bet he'd catch me here. He sank beside me, knee nudging mine, hands hovering near my hips, growling catching was my mess, bet I'd twist him out. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying twisting was my vibe, bet he'd roll with it. He leaned in, hand brushing my waist, muttering rolling was dumb, bet I'd tip us. I smirked, teased, saying tipping was my thrill, bet he'd steady me. The bed creaked, tension snapping, when headlights flared, Mom's voice roared, home early, yelling where we were. I froze, rolled off, yanking my top, heart pounding, muttering she's back, bet we're done. Kel jumped up, cursing, saying timing was hell, bet she'd flip. Mom stormed in, bags crashing, eyes blazing, screaming why I was in his room, drunk? I stammered it was nothing, bet she'd blow it up. She grabbed my arm, yelling at Kel he'd lost it, out, we're gone. He said I'd sparked it, bet she'd see my fault, but she shoved past, hauled me to my room, stuffed my bag, shouting we're leaving, now. I slumped, buzzed dead, knowing I'd lit it, I bet it burned us flat. The night after the bar, Mom's return loomed over our 2-week dance in our Detroit house. Her work trip ending early, her last text a rough bet I'd kept things quiet, wildly off. We'd lurched home past 3 a.m., drunk on bar beers, the truck weaving as I'd teased Kel he'd burned the floor, bet he'd burn me too. He'd smirked, parked crooked, and we'd stumbled inside, my head spinning from booze and his pull. I'd felt it all night, his hands, his heat, and I wasn't backing off. In my jeans and top, I swayed in the hall, kicking off my jacket, flirty, saying he'd owned that crowd, bet he'd claim me next. He smirked, slammed the door, his tee tight, jeans loose, muttering claiming was my hustle, bet I'd wreck it fast. I grinned, tripped closer, my hip brushing his, teasing that wrecking was my spark, bet he'd snatch it. He grabbed my wrists, light, playful, pulling me toward his room, growling I'd gone too far, bet I'd sink us tonight. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest with my shoulder, saying sinking was my rush, bet he'd dive in anyway. He pushed the door open, his hand grazing my arm, guiding me inside, muttering diving was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I flopped onto his bed, my top shifting, teasing he looked wild, bet he'd pin me here. He dropped beside me, his knee nudging mine, hands hovering near my hips, light, growling pinning was my mess, bet I'd twist him out. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying twisting was my vibe, bet he'd roll with it. He leaned in, his hand brushing my waist, warm through my shirt, muttering rolling was dumb, bet I'd tip us over. I smirked, teased, saying tipping was my thrill, bet he'd steady me. He shifted closer, his shoulder grazing mine, his voice low, teasing that steadying was my game, bet I'd slip anyway. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying slipping was my win, bet he'd catch me sharp. The room buzzed, tension thick, and I stretched, my hand brushing his arm, teasing he was too good, bet he'd flare tonight. He smirked, his hand sliding to my elbow, light, pulling me nearer, muttering flaring was my chaos, bet I'd blaze him out. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying blazing was my rush, bet he'd fan it slow. His fingers tapped my hip, teasing, his breath rough, growling fanning was my trap, bet I'd burn him raw. I laughed, my knee brushing his thigh, saying burning was my play, bet he'd fall for it. Then headlights cut the dark, the front door crashed open, Mom's voice ripping through, yelling where we were, back a day early. I froze, scrambled off, yanking my top straight, heart slamming, muttering she's here, bet we're screwed. Kel bolted up, cursing, smoothing his shirt, saying timing was trash, bet she'd lose it. I lurched to the hall, Mom charging in, bags hitting the floor, eyes blazing, screaming why I was in his room, drunk? I stammered it was nothing, bet she'd blow it up. She grabbed my arm, yelling at Kel he'd crossed lines, get out, we're done. She dragged me to my room, threw my stuff in a bag, her hands shaking, shouting we're leaving, now. Kel stood in the hall, saying I'd started it, bet she'd see my spark, but she shoved past, hauled me to the car, tires screeching as we peeled out, leaving him in the dust. I slumped, buzz gone, knowing I'd ignited it, bet it torched us all.